Hello, everyone. I welcome you all to today's Influence 21 webinar hosted by the Newmark Group. The Newmark Group is a global influence strategy firm that empowers brands and individuals to build influence. My name is Matthews Kavamba. I'm your host for today, and I'll be the moderator for the session that we have titled Credibility and Impact in Climate Change Communications. Just a few housekeeping rules before we begin. This webinar is going to have a Q&A session. So as we have our interactions with the guests that I'll introduce a bit later, please prepare your questions, and even as they speak, and if there's something that strikes you, you can support our guests by hitting your favorite emoji so that we keep the conversations going. Now, today's conversation comes at a critical time, as organizations and sectors step up their sustainability commitments. The expectation is no longer just about who is acting or who is doing what, but the need to communicate those actions clearly, transparently, and with credibility. To help us unpack this conversation, I've got an illustrious panel that has built a reputation in this area. We are expecting to have Dr. Mwene Hamwinga, an engineer and an academician from the Copperbelt University. Then on the panel right now, we have Mr. Gilbert Manrakiza, the co-founder of the Newmark Group, a seasoned brand leadership expert who has advised global companies on reputation, strategy, and impact. Gilbert, can you just give us a wave? Thank you. Then also we have Mr. Venen Sondo, a co-founder of Change Afrique, an award-winning sustainability strategist and a co-inventor with over 20 years of experience in advancing circular economy solutions and ESG integrations. Mr. Sondo, can you please just give a wave to our followers today? All right. At this moment, I'll even give the floor to Gilbert. Can you just please maybe give us, for those that are unaware, who is Gilbert Manrakiza, and just tell us more a bit about the Newmark Group.
Thanks, Matthews, and I'm very happy to be here for this very exciting conversation. And also, Venan, it's really a pleasure based on at Chained Afrique, but also in your career. I'm sure we are going to have an amazing conversation this afternoon for those in this hemisphere, and perhaps for others it might be other time zones when you get to see this video. Gilbert Manirakiza is a passionate Pan-Africanist who is also an influence strategist. That means that I help organizations alongside my colleagues at Newmark and at Weza ProSoft and our other teams to shape the influence of organizations so that they can be able to achieve the impact that they desire to achieve, and hopefully for that impact to then help them inspire the world. We believe that it's not enough to achieve impact in terms of sales, in terms of growth. We also believe that it's important to take the ingredients of that success and impact and use that to inspire others. And I think that is very relevant for the conversation we have today, because obviously organizations that are getting it right when it comes to ESG and sustainability, certainly they should be able then to be forces for good by inspiring other organizations to do so. And we have done work around ESG communications for quite a while. The Newmark has been, Newmark as an agency has been around for 15 years, and we operate across 30 plus countries, particularly across the African continent, but also now we have a global footprint through affiliates in the PRGN network, but also through our other partnerships and subsidiaries around the world. So we are very happy to be here, and I'm very excited to have this conversation. Back to you, Matthews.
Thank you so much, Group Gilbert, for that elaborate introduction. Mr. Sondo, can you just please introduce yourself and tell us more about who the name Sondo is?
Yeah, so I didn't need to be talking twice. I'm Venan Sundo. As Matthew said, it's a great opportunity to be here to talk about credibility in climate communication. I'm a trained environmental scientist, wandered across the century, wandered across the globe for 25 years now, across Europe and back in Africa now, and sort of sit on the nexus between sustainable finance, ESG, and circular economy. At Change, we pride ourselves in enabling the circular economy, where we work with government entities, on the policy side, enabling policy, like I did back leading the team in PwC that developed the sustainable banking principles in Ghana, as well as the circular economy action plan for Ghana. And then we work with corporate entities, those that are kind of trying to transition to reporting or basically to sustainable choices, because our sort of focus is on the fact that if we don't make sustainable choices affordable, available, accessible and aspirational to the masses, then it's very difficult for us to meet either the climate goals or the sustainable development goals. That is why you find us working across three various pillars, across the policy side with the government entities, the corporate side, and with the communities. In our project Net Cycle, where we educate communities and also link them to global markets, especially for circular economy attributes like the waste fish nets, which is generally a global phenomenon, abandoned, lost, or otherwise discarded fishing gear. Over 650,000 of these actually wash into our oceans every year. And just like Gilbert, I'm a sort of very passionate Pan-Africanist. And I hope that solutions that we develop should not generally be used in one country. We're hoping that it can actually be used across various countries, replicated across Africa, so we can actually be able to meet the challenges, as Pan-Africans, not necessarily as silos in various countries. So at Chain, as I said, we basically enable the circular economy via special projects. And it's great to talk about climate credibility and climate communication, because that is what we do in our ESG training, where we sort of enable practitioners to be certified as the ESG practitioner. And one of the key issues we face there, it's not that we face, that we do, is actually educate them about being able to spot greenwashing and to avoid greenwashing. So it's great to be able to talk about those attributes here, and I look forward to an exciting conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that elaborate introduction. Now, Gilbert, just to set the context, you have advised different brands and individuals in the way to communicate their efforts. From a strategic perspective, what are some of the most common mistakes you think organizations make when they're trying to communicate their climate or ESG efforts? Or um, all organizations are trying to communicate, but not all of them are doing it right. So, what mistakes have you observed in your line of work?
Yeah, thank you, Matthews. I think that that's actually a very fundamental question, and let me just put into perspective the question you're asking. Essentially, what you're asking is what should effective ESG and sustainability communication look like, and how many organizations are getting it wrong? Let me answer the second part of this and say that most are getting it wrong, and then come back to the first part, which is what should it actually look like. In our practice at the Newmark Group over the last 15 years, having worked with some of the largest brands in the world, having seen some of the best practices there are out there, not just in terms of ESG and sustainability communications, but also across the board in terms of brand communications, generally speaking. We have developed a framework for defining what good communication should look like. And essentially what it should look like is it should look like influence. And what influence is the ability of a brand, both individual brand and corporate brand or institutional brand, to shape the emotions, the perceptions, the opinions, the decisions, and the actions of others without necessarily resorting to power or coercion. That's what influence is. And therefore, effective communication should lead to influence in that sense and should help organizations and brands that are communicating to foster change in behavior and to induce different types of decisions, not just internally, but also externally. That is, for us, the highest level of communication success. And therefore, the question of what are some of the common mistakes? Well, I could easily um, categorize the mistakes into, I would say, two categories. The first category is that of organizations that believe that ESG and sustainability or CSR and such things are reporting exercises. You will see many banks and large organizations, insurance companies, DFIs, et cetera, organizing large events to launch their reports. And they will tell you how they are complying with this standard and that standard, so forth. And that is, I believe, a very positive development. It's something that is very good to be done because obviously there needs to be accountability. Where it tends to be a bit of a challenge is when, by and large, ESG is viewed as a reporting exercise as opposed to being an influence building opportunity. The reporting itself should not be that we celebrate. We should actually be focusing on looking at this report and saying, how can we use what we have learned to help foster change, to help expand adoption of this and that practice. So, for example, if we have made some contribution to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, how can we use the knowledge that we have among our clients, for example, or among our suppliers, and some are doing it, but or also among our communities to be able to drive adoption of some of these best practices. That, in my view, is the epitome of communication excellence and success, because therefore you're not just communicating what you have done, but you're going out of your way to induce new behavior, to communicate and to break down what you have done into adoptable practices, best practices. The thing is, our communities and human beings in general really want to be equipped to be able to adopt certain behaviors. And therefore, that becomes a very important piece, in my view, that should be part of how we rate the success of our communication efforts when it comes to ESG. Now, that means that you actually have to augment, and this goes to my second dimension. The first dimension is not treating ESG communications as launching a report or a reporting exercise. And once you have made that determination, then the next step is you have to augment the framework that you use. That is, you have to go beyond communicating the great things you have done and reporting, in essence, and then come up with a framework for generating knowledge that will be helpful to different types of audiences, which means now you have to use that content that you have, the data and all the lessons that you have learned to equip your constituents and your communities, and this requires a framework. And in our case, we call it, the influence framework, which has 3 different pillars. I might not have time to go into it in detail, but essentially the first pillar is really just about diagnosing your environment, really learning how your ecosystem players communicate. a report may be a fantastic output for your regulators, if you're a bank, for example, or any other entity which has reporting requirements. But the report, 300 pages long A4 may not be the best output for your media. And luckily, many of those who do reports also will generate a press release, and we will help them do such things. But you have to go beyond that. You have to have a campaign on your social media platforms. You have to train your employees to talk to your customers about some of the things that we are doing that they could also do. You have to train your procurement system. You have to train your investors. You have to talk to and you have to equip a broader ecosystem to take up the messages and the lessons and apply them in other ways. And for that, you will, as I said just now, need a system. And the first pillar is to diagnose. The second pillar would be what we call to build a program, a communication program around it, by making sure that you have defined how to capture the attention of your stakeholders, how to connect emotionally with them with the data that you have, because you have to realize that if there is no relatability vis-a-vis what you have to say, audiences will simply not see themselves in that story, that ESG story. And if you over rely on the institutional tone, you will not have enough likability among the public for them to even give you the goodwill and for you to actually, as a brand, benefit from additional sales, additional brand value, and things like that. And it's very important because we see the sustainability and ESG ecosystem suffering globally because of likability and a relatability shortfall. The last bit would be to make sure that you actually convert that emotional likability that you have built over time into more adoption of the best practices that you are spearheading, that you're pioneering. I believe that that would constitute what many organizations should be doing, and unfortunately not as many are doing it, but we are seeing this changing because in our practice we are starting to work with a number of organizations in building programs, communication programs that are not just about communicating about a report, but actually about educating, inspiring, and driving more adoption of the best practices. I'll stop there, Matthews. Back to you.
Thank you, Gilbert, for that elaborate explanation. And I think what strikes me the most is that it's not really just about communicating, like you had put it. And this really is just summed up in one word: influence. How do you ensure that people really adopt what you are communicating? And I think that's well explained. I'll come to you, Venan. In terms of at the moment, we see a lot of circular economy initiatives, but the question would be, how would these initiatives, for example, strengthen the credibility of corporate climate and sustainability commitments for organizations and individuals?
I will probably take a step back and sort of maybe throw some light on what exactly the circular economy actually is. It's nothing inherently new. We have been practicing the circular economy across this part of the globe for so long. The practice has been there. What is actually missing is the matrix to report on that practice, because ever so often it's kind of confused with recycling. It's not recycling per se. The circular economy on the recycling is basically, I think, the seed initiative in terms of priorities of the circular economy. You only recycle after you can't, reuse, refurbish, remanufacture, and all that, upcycle. And then you come to the circular economy, to the recycling aspect, when you have to sort of like transform it into something else. If you look at all commitments that have been made by most of the various country nationally determined contributions with respect to their declarations, with respect to their commitments to meeting global climate emissions, previously, most of those communications focused on renewable energy and energy efficiency. And then it was realized that, all those commitments can't meet our target goal of making sure we don't increase global temperatures by 1.5 degrees by 2030. Then the circular economy became very, very important because it was realized that somehow we missed integrating our relationship with materials and how that is linked to climate emissions. And that is why the circular economy became very important, especially with respect to climate emissions mitigation, because materials they inform every activity that we do, basically, right? And so, especially when it comes to communication, previously, most entities with CSR report was more like reporting on an activity that took place in a certain community. But that doesn't necessarily include metrics like, okay, if it were a waste management initiative, for example, how many tons of plastics was actually avoided or displaced or extracted, or how did that initiative continue to impact on the population? How many people were actually employed in that community because of that initiative? So what the circular economy does is it literally puts metrics and makes communication more tangible, right? Because it tends to sort of report on material flows within the supply chain, within value chains. And when you have particularly metrics being sort of ascribed to material flow, for example, amount of waste displaced from a certain community, amount of emissions that have been displaced because of switching from diesel to solar, amount of wastewater that was treated in terms of volumes of water. All that makes communication very, very tangible because it becomes verifiable. It becomes traceable, and it actually really helps with informing performance. I don't want to delve into the difference between sustainability and ESG now because there's a whole different ball game. But generally, with your sustainability initiatives, you are literally reporting on how am I performing on my waste management? How am I implementing waste management? Sorry, how am I implementing water efficiency? How am I implementing energy efficiency? You are literally reporting on what you are doing. But ESG is literally your performance. How well are you performing in your waste management, in your water resource efficiency, in your supply chain management? And the circular economy, when you sort of play it into that narrative, it literally helps you be able to quantify, because the models are literally very tangible. It reports on material flow in terms of from A to B. And so when well incorporated in your communication, it gives readers a lot more confidence, especially when you talk about science-based reporting. It can really tell you about how well you have performed based on, I have been able to reduce my emissions from 20% to 15% based on a 2015 baseline that you can actually show, right? So when you report based on especially circular economy models, it literally makes your communication a lot more tangible, a lot more traceable, and gives your audience, especially if it's folks who don't really understand some of these thematics, it gives them a good understanding of what you're talking about and kind of builds trust especially not just with communities, but then if you're talking to investors and your disclosures, which actually have to be inherent in some more or less is your risk, it's more your exposure. You're telling an investor, I am going to be exposed to X physical risk or X transition risk. And how does that impact on your business model? And I think it's worthwhile pointing out that the circular economy, it's a tool that we can actually really use to enhance on our reporting, especially when the models are well integrated within our operational scenario, especially within corporates. I will stop there for now, and I think a lot more is going to come from other questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Colleagues on the call, please remember that you can send your questions even at this moment in the Q&A chat. Then when we come to the Q&A segment, I'll be able to throw the questions to our guests, even based on what you have heard so far. So Gilbert, will come to you in terms of communication over data. Companies have to be aware that they are communicating to different stakeholders who might find maybe the translation of that sustainability data has to be to the simplest form of it. So how can companies effectively translate complex sustainability data, into clear, credible messages without really simplifying them or risking misinterpretation?
Thank you, Matthews, for that question. And it's indeed a relevant question because many organizations have serious challenges with the communication of the data stemming from their ESG activities. And I'm very happy that Venan talked about the difference between ESG and sustainability and CSR and all these things, all these concepts. And that shows you that even I, as a seasoned, experienced communication professional, can sometimes not necessarily articulate the differences between these concepts. And that goes to show that you can easily lose the audience when you are talking about things like ESG. And actually, even in this webinar, we have made a mistake of not defining what ESG is, in case there are people here who don't know what that concept is. ESG is essentially an acronym standing for environmental, social, and governance practices of organizations, and it's one of those pillars of the life of an organization that tends to be either regulated or encouraged, whereby organizations are encouraged, for example, to engage in ESG practices to improve their environmental management, social stewardship, as well as governance practices that are healthy for the communities that they serve, etc. And then also there is generally an encouragement to report on these ESG practices that organizations are engaged in. And I just wanted to make sure that we understand at least my understanding of the word ESG, but I'm sure that Venan can provide a more nuanced definition of this concept. And this is important. Understanding definitions is important because it goes into understanding the data that is being communicated about these concepts. Generally speaking, practitioners in the ESG space or in the sustainability space or in this general ecosystem will tend to be very excited about the data, particularly statistical data, the numbers, the percentage change in our emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions, the number of individuals that have been enrolled into XYZ social initiative, etc., etc. And it is very important to be able to track data, especially statistical data. However, it's very easy as well to lose the audience when you only talk about statistical data, especially given that things like environmental data can be quite complex and scientific in nature. And you need that scientific complexity in order to be credible. So you don't want to oversimplify such numbers and concepts because you will lose credibility. But on the other hand, if you overcomplicate how you're communicating your data, you lose the audience, you lose likability and relatability. And we know that the word that Venon mentioned is very critical, and that word is trust. Trust is extremely important when it comes to outcomes of ESG communication, in the sense that you want people to trust that what you are saying is not only accurate, but is also understandable, and is also coming from a place of proper documentation and research and things like that. But we know also from our research at Newmark and in the broader influence community that trust depends on three major things. The first thing is authority. You need to have an authoritative voice in what you're doing. So the data that you are communicating should be authoritatively sourced, but also authoritative in and of itself. Secondly, you need to have likability. And this is where now we talk about you being able to build a brand that is trusted, that is liked, that people consider to be a positive force for good. It's going to be very difficult for harmful organizations, at least organizations that are seen to be harmful, to build trust, generally speaking, simply because there is a likability factor that they don't have. So likability is very important. Thirdly, you need social proof. It's not enough for you to just talk about the good things that you're doing and to only report the data that you have. You also should leverage the voices of the people that or organizations that have either benefited from your activity, your ESG activities, or that have been inspired by what you're doing. So between authority, likability, and social proof, you can create a very powerful data communication platform that makes it easier for different audiences to understand you. So for example, let me just make it more concrete. If you're going to be communicating to a number of communities on the positive lessons you have learned from a certain intervention, you may probably want to use one of their own, and thus you are leveraging social proof, but also you are leveraging likability. And that's where now making sure that you are not just doing things to your beneficiaries, but you are also giving them agency. You're also giving them a voice. That tends to drive up trust over and above the data. And I believe that that's a very important practice. Luckily, we see many organizations adopting this practice. Obviously, you have to take into account things like confidentiality and protecting people's private data and things like that. So you have to seek their permission if you're going to be using their voices and data and things like that. But essentially, it's very important that data is human. So it means that the real world impact behind the data is going to be a very important asset for you. And you have to realize that the data itself is important, yes, mostly for you. It's the human impact that is mostly important for the other humans that you're dealing with. And that also means that you have to segment your audiences very well and know what to communicate to whom. The kind of information and channels and packaging of data that you put together for a regulator is going to be different from an investor, is going to be different from rural communities, urban communities, etc., etc. So it's important to have a fairly sophisticated approach to how we communicate data, generally speaking. And lastly, I just want to say that the focus really should not necessarily be on the data itself. Data should support the story. That's the key perspective. The story should be we are changing the lives, we are impacting the lives of XYZ community, or we are committed to embarking on a journey to help the world fight climate change, because climate change ultimately leads to more floods, and more floods mean more hunger and more sickness in our communities. That's really the story. And the data is coming to support that story, as an example. And also the other thing is, ideally the data should be translated into meaning, which is again related to that storytelling element I've just talked about, in the sense of answering the questions of why does this matter in the first place? What has changed? What's next, if there is a next bit? And lastly, if you have some evidence to back up the data, well and good. And that's where I talked about the social proof element, which brings in third-party validation. If you can get some external experts to come in, people like Venan, who have that kind of expertise, to come in and look at what you have done and tell you yes, and give you that marker of validation, I think that's a very good practice, because data, yes, it's important, but more important is the story that the data tells about you, about your commitment, and about your journey. Back to you, Matthews.
All right. Thank you so much, Gilbert. The issue of trust even takes me to my next question. Trust is usually anchored on two fundamental things. That's transparency and accountability. So, Venan, maybe what someone out there might be wanting to find out is the role of investors and financial institutions in pushing companies towards more transparency and accountability in their ESG communications. What role do you think they play in this scope?
Um, uh, the long and short of it is they play a very critical role. If you look at what was happening in Ghana before the rollout of the sustainable banking principles, for example, just across Africa anyway, because most national or central banks now signing up to the network of sustainable banks. Basically, there was some sort of uneven playing field when it came to financing or rewarding entities who actually were doing purposefully embarking on being responsible. So back then, if you went to a bank like, some banks will literally not ask you a lot of questions when it has to come to the environmental performance of a project. And some banks will ask basically because they have a more focused risk aspect of integrating the impact of environmental and social issues related to the projects that they invest in. So the Bank of Ghana said, we will develop a standard, a set of sustainable banking principles that all the banks will need to sort of like ascribe to. I happen to lead the team that developed that in Ghana. So basically said, these are going to be our minimum disclosures with respect to our environmental and social exposures. These are going to be our minimum governance disclosures or practice. We're going to have an ESG desk, a desk that is going to focus on helping us integrate ESG across our operations. And the Bank of Ghana has even taken it one step forward, one step up. They have said, can you sort of show me how you're integrating climate finance risk in your operations, kind of the climate financial risk disclosure directive, where all banks have to integrate how they have to disclose how they integrate climate change risk into their operations. So bottom line is, when the investors, right, sort of have minimum standards with respect to the ESG disclosure, you can see the amount of ESG aligned funds at the moment. Most funds, probably 90% of them, are all ESG aligned because they have minimum sort of things that they will look at at an investment before they invest. Basically, they are hedging their risk. They're kind of making sure that they're not exposing themselves to environmental issues. They're not exposing themselves to social issues. They're not exposing themselves to governance sort of weaknesses that would impact on their investment. So, and then someone will say, but then what is the essence of ESG rating, for example? So let's say two mining firms, they produce an ESG report, a sustainability report with an ESG sort of like framework alignment in terms of how they're performing their sustainability performance. They have an ESG report. An investor would actually want to understand how well is mining firm A performing over mining firm B. And that is where ESG rating actually comes in place. That is where they understand how well the two firms are performing based on their ESG performance. And that is what they sort of invest in, the firm that will have a higher ESG performance. Long story short, it's been proven that during COVID, most of the ESG aligned firms were those who are actually best performing during the early days of COVID, because every stock was going down, but most of the ESG aligned stocks actually staying up, simply because they had been able to kind of cover issues with their supply chain exposures, which kind of led to the global supply chain shutdown. So I've literally been able to tell you, investors and the financial regulators, it's not like their responsibility, but they play a big role with respect to regulating how firms disclose and what they disclose. And this also helps with sort of giving the public confidence with respect to what the firms are supposed to be disclosing on. So at the end of the day, it's not about how well you disclose, how close your sustainability report is, how close your ESG report is. As Gilbert was saying, you can have all the data, but then there is no empathy in the story. And that empathy in the story is what inspires people, because you've been able to kind of relate that data to how it affects your bottom line, your triple P's, your people in terms of your employees, their well-being, the population, people that you work with, the community, as well as how it informs on your profit. So when you are able to kind of use the data to inspire trust by making sure that you have a good story, which literally explains to people that, especially, this is where I am coming from, right? I am not perfect. I still have this sort of transitional risk that I'm exposed to. So it's not about being perfect in everything, but actually accepting where you have shortcomings with respect to where you are. You know that you have a challenge in terms of a weakness, but you're being very, very open in disclosing it. And so some regulators actually reward ESG disclosures. In the Bank of Ghana now, in Ghana, I'll speak for Ghana because I know what's happening in Ghana. Every quarter, each bank has to disclose their sustainability ESG performance to the Bank of Ghana. Every quarter has to be reported on, right? And the banks that don't report, of course, they would actually find themselves wanting, especially from the public perspective, from their shareholders, because that is already a risk. You are not complying to a regulatory demand with respect to disclosing how well we are performing with our ESG performance. So I think it is incredibly important that we see the narrative with respect to what is happening globally. You can see the wave of sustainable banking principles coming across Africa. You can see the wave of climate risk integration within banking operations. You can see a wave of consumers actually becoming activists with respect to demanding from their, not just from the financial institutions, from the regulators, what demanding better disclosures from them. And as Gilbert said, your ESG communication is actually sort of well designed. When you report from a strictly performance position, performance with respect to this is how I am meeting regulatory compliance. This is how I am meeting stakeholder demands. This is how I'm meeting investor demands. And all that communication is actually best if your so-called ESG framework was based on a very sound materiality understanding. Materiality basically means you have literally been able to report on the things that are important to your business. And those things that are important to your business are the things that the regulatory sort of policy agenda is saying, the things that your stakeholders are saying, the things that your community are saying, the things that your investors are saying, the things that your employees in terms of your board are saying. So that communication, when it is holistic and covering all these aspects, when it's actually reporting on your core material issues, then you will rest assured that your communication actually aligns with regulatory demands. And regulatory demand will literally shape how sectors disclose on their performance. And so it is absolutely crucial. And you can see it actually happening across Africa. There's a lot of demand now for financial institutions, especially to disclose on their ESG performance. How well they are faring is also a big issue. You can see sustainability reporting in most African countries is going to be mandatory by 2030. In Nigeria, for example, SMEs are going to be mandated to disclose on their ESG performance by 2030, mandatorily. Now in Nigeria, it's mandatory across certain sectors, especially those on the stock exchange or other financial institutions. But by 2030, you see it's going to cut across, and then you're going to have millions of SMEs across Africa are going to start reporting on their ESG performance. So you see how the shift is going to happen. And you can see how regulators across Africa are literally shaping up and making sure that happens. And one thing I want to end with is the fact that most of the financial institutions, some of the banks, they are realizing that they can't report on their own. They need to educate their customers with respect to what they are reporting on. That education literally helps take everybody along with respect to what they're supposed to be reporting on. I don't want to go into issues of CBAM, for example, in terms of how it actually helped European entities meet their carbon leakage issues, where those that sort of like the carbon intense industry, for example, like the mining or sort of like steel, they would buy steel cheaper from other places in the world because they are not regulated with respect to carbon. But then those producing steel in Europe kind of suffer. So they actually implemented that cross kind of carbon border pricing mechanism, so that carbon pricing then becomes sort of covered, so that those who produce locally in Europe would not be cheated out by those who go to other places where there is no carbon regulation and buy steel and import it to Europe. You see how regulators actually can help shape with ESG compliance. I hope that kind of gives an idea about the role of regulators and how important it is. Back in the days, we used to say regulators are not doing enough, but then I'm glad it's actually rooted in most regulators' policies at the moment. When you have all countries being required to kind of meet their climate emissions by a certain goal by 2030, you see how this is cutting across. Some of the banks have been pushed to do more. And when the banks who finance the economy start pushing, then you see how issues of climate change can then be met by regulating how disclosures are made publicly. So thanks for that.
All right. Thank you so much. That's a very proactive move that has been taken by the Central Bank of Ghana, that Ghana example that you gave. And I hope other regulators across different sectors also can try to be as proactive. But also, it's something good to know the projection that you've given for 2030, for example, for us to really reach that milestone that you've said, would need a more, I think, persistence from different regulators. So it's good to hear. For those that have just joined us, the conversation continues here on Newmark Influence 21 webinar. So Gilbert, maybe as we begin to descend into the Q&A questions, let's talk about talking green but not doing green, greenwashing. Most organizations tend to paint themselves more environmental friendly than they might really are. In terms of the practical steps that organizations can take to ensure that their communication really aligns with the actual performance. Venan had indicated the issue of performance. What, how can companies and organizations avoid greenwashing in essence?
Matthews, I think the way you positioned the question sort of gives a piece of the answer. To avoid greenwashing, you need to talk green, you need to say green, but also you need to be experienced green. One of the challenges is that many organizations might actually talk about all the things that they are doing, but the primary beneficiaries or stakeholders in their ecosystem are not actually either experiencing or seeing what these organizations are doing. And that could be a communication weakness, or it could be due to a communication weakness, or it could just be due to how that organization has set up the actual doing of ESG practices. And therefore, they might actually be perceived as greenwashing because there is a break somewhere in that influence chain of what they are saying, what they are doing, and how they are experienced, which means that, again, there has to be a very deliberate effort, and I would even call it a program, to ensure that communication is not just the end result of what you're doing, but also the progress towards the end result. Many organizations tend to focus on communicating on the big report, on the big achievements, even though communicating progress is just as important, because sometimes that is actually part of how your brand will be experienced as being one of the positive forces for good that are actually doing ESG. So it's important to communicate the practical steps, the measures, the investments, even just some of the conversations that are taking place, as long as these are not empty conversations, but they will actually lead to some kind of progress. So start with that approach to communication. In addition to the approach, which is a conversational approach as opposed to a communication approach, you actually have to also include in the early stages of communication a very detailed diagnosis. And that diagnosis would have different dimensions to it. You need to understand exactly what you're doing and what you're communicating and the gap between the two. You need to also identify any inconsistencies that may have occurred or that could be occurring, and that could be affecting the perception of greenwashing, because sometimes it's a perception. And also it might be important to think about building the proof foundation, or the foundation of proof, before promoting what you're doing. Although I talked about being able to communicate progress, that doesn't necessarily mean claiming things that do not really exist or that are not on the way to existing. So there is a thin line between those two approaches to communication, which is communicate progress, but it needs to be progress, and there needs to be proof that that progress is actually taking place. Otherwise, without the evidence, it might actually be a setup for you being considered as greenwashing. And lastly, I believe that it's important to ideally, like I said earlier, include third-party voices as much as possible. If you can include experts that bring in that validation, that verification, I believe is going to be very helpful to avoid greenwashing. And organizations may not be able to do this, especially if they are smaller. And I think that that's where now you bring in colleagues and employees to come in and add a voice to what's going on. We've seen that, for example, employee advocacy in certain organizations has really helped them communicate in a very relatable way with external audiences, and also communicate information that otherwise would have landed flatly. But because it came from this authentic voice of employees, it made it easier to communicate it, and it made it more accessible even. So aligning internal and external communication might actually be a very strategic thing for organizations to do in order to avoid the challenge of perceived greenwashing. Although anyone who is actually perceived as being involved in greenwashing with good cause, then you deserve everything that is coming to you. But if you feel like your organization is actually doing a lot and it is having a great impact, but that is not really being appreciated at the right value, then you need to consider some of the things I've just mentioned, because otherwise a greenwashing tag is very, very hard to shake once it settles, because people will just dismiss any future efforts you make to communicate what you might actually be genuinely doing. And therefore, it's important to invest in this. And I like something that Venant said about the future of ESG and ESG communication, which is the fact that we all have to ultimately join that bandwagon. And I look forward to that day when SMEs and big and small companies are all going to be disclosing and reporting and communicating, not necessarily as an obligation by a regulator, as is the case in the banking sector. And I confirm that Kenya also has the same requirement, and many other African countries are introducing such requirements, especially in the financial sector. So I would want us to adopt this as a way of life, because organizations, companies are built by humans for humans, and ESG is something that is supposed to help humans live in a better environmental, social, and governance ecosystem. And therefore, ultimately, it should be something that we all become excited about and we want to do, not just because someone is telling us we have to do it, although that's a good start, but also because we genuinely feel like we want to live this world better than we found it. Thanks, Matthews. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Gilbert, for those insights that ensure that organizations are not just talking green, but they are really, really being green. Before we head into our Q&A session, I've seen there's a question for you, Vinan. But maybe as we wind up on this segment of our conversations, how can organizations ensure that sustainability messages reflect the real economic and social value for communities on the ground? Because at the end of the day, the impact has to be felt on the ground.
I think we have a tendency with corporates actually losing out on value, on data that is value in their reporting, simply because they don't take enough time to study their communities. Because at the end of the day, if you are sort of going to report on a sustainability initiative, it's critically important that you always establish a baseline within that community in terms of where they were before the intervention. And what happens there is, if you understand aspects of jobs that have been created, aspects of safety, aspects of cultural preservation, and all sorts of resilience issues, that were gaps in the community in terms of their community resilience, then you can literally sort of capture this in a way that defines value with respect to how you report on your sustainability engagement. Because when you talk about the things that actually affect the community, it's not only about empathy, but it's about inspiring what you are doing in a way that really mirrors and talks about the impact that you can be able to tangibly create in the community. And so when it comes from the backdrop of talking about how many jobs were created in the community, how many talking about health, talking about resilience, it's always important to measure that with respect to the impact, with respect to what is the shared value that was created because of that intervention. That shared value literally is what inspires. That shared value is what literally makes the community sort of like they buy into the narrative perspective. This is what has literally been done. This kid in this neighborhood, that kid in this neighborhood, that kid, this neighborhood actually got employed from this initiative. It is tangible, right? This health center, this was done. That project in terms of air pollution, this is how many kids were suffering from aspects of from asthma 1 year ago. That has improved in the community because of that project. Then the shared value with respect to what was done was actually well represented. And also what you need to do there in terms of communicating is literally integrating the voices of the community in your report. Let people from the community actually say that, yes, we benefit for them. Let them be able to share their own story. Let them be able to actually say exactly how they benefited from it. That actually adds a lot of credibility to the report. And most importantly, everybody always wants to kind of tell the story nice, but they actually try not to talk about the limitations. Talking about the limitations is also very important. It's always good to actually mention the trade-offs and the trade-offs that would probably not happen, those that may not be affected, because that actually makes your story authentic. Because not everybody is going to benefit from a particular transition within the community. And so if you're actually forthcoming and actually disclose that, okay, yes, I'm going to introduce clean cooking within the community, but yes, we appreciate the fact that not everybody is going to be able to benefit from it because of X, Y, and Z. That inspires authenticity, and actually gives your sustainability report a good backing. So those are the kind of 4 key attributes that you need to consider. Make sure you are reporting with baseline perspective. Make sure you are kind of reporting the trade-offs, community voices integrated, and most importantly, you are literally designing with the community together. That actually helps with enhancing the narrative of reporting any sustainability initiative within communities. Thanks for that, Matthew.
Thank you very much for those insights. We've now come to the Q&A segment of our webinar, and I'm glad one of the questions that has come is something that we might even have ignored during the course of these conversations. And either you, Venan, or Gilbert, you can pick up this one. There's a question from Paul Mwanga, who's saying, how do political interests shape what climate information is amplified or suppressed? In terms of, yes.
Thanks. I'll quickly jump in, but Venan,
yes.
Venan, please go ahead. Yeah, so I'll just jump in. So I think we've definitely seen how political leadership can affect, as you put it, Paul, what climate information is amplified or suppressed, or even what initiatives are pursued by governments or companies in different parts of the world. Now, speaking particularly about the West, if I can put it that way, we have seen how different administrations, depending on whether they are on the right or on the left of the political divide, might have different views. And when there is a leftist government in one country, they might, for example, feel like, we need to maintain traditional perspectives on the climate conversation, regardless of what maybe the science is saying, or regardless of what certain other perspectives might be saying, and that could be almost a stark opposite to what another government. I think it's on the far right side of the political divide that you'll find things like that. People having voices against some of the, for example, climate change narratives that we've seen over the last few years.
Well, I mean, it is clear that in Africa, politicians have probably the loudest, platform to amplify their agendas. So it's always very easy for climate information to be skewed with respect to what political party. But then you've actually seen a lot more climate emphasis in political agendas across Africa. It's not just talk about employment and agriculture, but you actually hear, you see political parties in Africa now having a climate memorandum in terms of how they are going to approach aspects of climate change, simply because from a national perspective, it's a national risk issue. And so addressing that builds credibility with respect to winning votes. And it's not just that. If you look at how the international agenda is going with respect to where the funding is going, it is very clear that if you don't sort of position yourself with the right sort of policies and activities, you would lose out on the global sort of like climate funding. Climate finance obviously is kind of trickling very low into Africa. Lots of challenges about that from how we have our policy set up, from how we structure our projects. But you would want to appreciate the fact that it is still very difficult, I don't know, I would say, to have a very, let's say, unbiased climate information disclosure, except climate disclosures were sort of rooted in a certain sort of how you sort of disclose information's act. I don't know. But the bottom line is every political party is going to use it the way they want to use it. But the onus is on, journalists and, civil rights societies to continue to educate the communities about very clear aspects of the climate agenda, letting them understand how they can literally decipher some of the messages that comes from politicians, and most importantly, how they can actually play a role as a society in participating in the whole climate agenda. So it can be amplified, yes, and it can easily be suppressed based on who is having the microphone to disclose whatever they want to disclose.
All right. Thank you so much. And Gilbert, welcome back. So even as you said, with Fernandez, there's a question for you in the Q&A from Wilfred, and this one now talks about: do you feel American organizations have fully embraced ESG reporting and its activities, or they do it to tick the boxes? Is it just something that they do just to tick the boxes, or it's been embraced? African
Well, I mean,
organizations.
it's a very fair question. It's a very valid question. It would depend on the sector, because you have the financial sector, for example, that is clearly regulated with respect to ESG disclosures. You can talk about the fact that reporting is still sort of an issue now. They're still actually, trying to report alongside GRI or ISSB or whatever format they adopt. But in the financial world, especially in Africa, I think it's pretty much clear to I can confidently say that it's actually been adopted, not just from a standpoint of regulatory sort of perspective, but from the fact that most banks actually rely on accessing funding from various entities to be able to operationalize their imperatives. So that they operate on getting funding to disburse credits, sort of, and loan facilities. And there are certain funds that you will not access if you don't have a set sort of, ESG framework in place, or ESMS sort of framework as a bank. There are certain funds that you will not be able to access. So you literally find yourself being uncompetitive, because those that have these frameworks in place, they have access to these funds, simply because the funds want to really be sure that the disbursements actually aligns with principles that govern best practice in making sure that environmental, social, and governance issues are actually taken into consideration. So it depends on the sector. Yes, some other sectors like the telcos, like the manufacturing, health, hospitality, some of them are doing it because of investor sort of requests, because investors are also actually demanding to see a set sort of minimum standard of environmental disclosures and performance in place before they can invest in certain business. And from some, it's more like consumers. Consumers are also kind of like really demanding certain. Consumers are more educated now. And so it is actually transitioning from a tick box exercise to real sort of like entities actually demonstrating their responsibility as corporates to be able to prove that they are integrating this. Of course, it has been proven that those who actually align their operations to certain sort of environmental and social standards perform better than those who don't implement them. So from where I stand, it is actually transitioning from a tick box exercise to a more sort of responsibility from those organizations, because it literally makes them competitive, respect to competitive in the market, and it makes them look better to investors, as well as they look better in front of regulators with respect to abiding to ESG reporting. So maybe Gilbert will have something to add to that. Thank you, Matthias.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Gilbert.
maybe,
Yes.
Yeah, Matthews. Thank you, and apologies, I had some internet issues, but just to pick up on that last point in regards to whether African companies are doing this as a box ticking exercise. To some extent, that's the starting point, and it's not a bad starting point. I think the fact that regulators have set the tone and said this matters to us as regulators, as governments, is already a sign that there must be some kind of demand side pressure on them. So whether it is donors or other partners who are saying we want, we want regulations that are fostering a healthier environment, better governance practices, or more social responsibility from corporates, whether it's a political push with populations asking to have better financial services that are responsive to those three things, I think it's still fine. You have to realize that the private sector at the end of the day is about a profit motive. That's the primary goal for any private company. And there is, technically speaking, no higher goal than that one, unless if markets make that goal secondary to healthier environment, healthier societies, and better governed societies, which is where demand side pressure has to come in. And this ties into that political question. There are some countries where publics have been demanding more corporate responsibility, better ESG accountability by large corporations. And because of that, it spills over into the politics. You have more elected officials who have that kind of leaning, and therefore it actually affects the composition of the political class. In other countries, it has actually been a polarizing factor. So what we are talking about here is actually not just a small thing for companies to think about. It's something that determines the outcome of elections in some countries. And I believe that in Africa, as more populations, or at least bigger proportions of the African population, become more educated about the scientific data that relates to climate impact, as more people become more demanding about the kind of society they want to live in, as people become more demanding about the type of governance they want their companies to have and their countries to have, you'll actually start seeing this spilling over into political movements with an underlying, because you have to realize that ESG is not just about something a company does. It's really about the kind of life, society, environment, and governance we want to live in and under. So it's inherently a political issue. It's just that the nitty gritty of it, the everyday execution of the different strategies by companies and so forth, looks like it's merely a box ticking exercise. But when you actually take a step back and look at the issue holistically, it is inherently something that touches how we define the kind of world we want to live in, how we define the kind of country we want to live in. And to some extent, ESG and sustainability are together because you want your ESG interventions to be sustainable over time and to be scalable in space, in that sense. So when you actually look at those two components of, having good practices that enhance our environment, society, and governance, and the need to make these sustainable and scalable over time and over space, you actually realize that every single human being, every single citizen should be caring about this. And the good thing is that thanks to social media, thanks to people being exposed to different debates in other parts of the world, there is a growing realization that this is not just something that companies can just ignore. And it's just a matter of time. And my warning is, if you're a large company in any sector, if you're not paying attention to this, it will come back to haunt you at some point. So it's better to start now, start small, start listening, even if it's just listening to your staff, finding out what they care about, the kind of leadership they want, the kind of governance they want, the kind of society they want to live in, and start thinking about how to invest in that, because ultimately that capital you are building now over time is going to pay off dividends when this is going to snowball. And I believe that Africa has shown that this is a continent that adopts things very fast. We leapfrogged mobile technology. We are leapfrogging AI, and we will leapfrog ESG and sustainability. I profoundly believe it, simply because that's what we do in Africa.
Wow, 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 wow. We've been here for almost a duration of an entire football match, and it just feels like this is when we're starting. It speaks to the extensiveness of this topic, but we have to close now. Venan, I would welcome your closing remarks, even your part away shots, even as we close the webinar.
Well, as Gilbert said, it's not just greenwashing. There's a lot of carbon washing. There is washing. There is rainbow washing, and all sort of washing out there. And I think it's important to note that consumers are a lot more exposed now, and they can actually easily, catch you up, kind of catch you out, respect to what you disclose. They can easily, chat GPT something and kind of, find you wanting, But I think the beauty about being credible in your communication is the fact that it is a responsibility that makes you a lot more authentic. It's not about glossy reports and all. That's not about talking about how nice you've done or how well you've done. It's basically always trying to kind of show less, but then have better data, but then most importantly, infuse community voices. When you tie all that in, then you have a report that engenders empathy, that sort of inspires, because it literally shows your tangible performance. It literally shows how well you do, and it actually, most importantly, credible communication. Literally, ultimate, bottom line, it wins trust, and without trust from your community, trust from your regulators, trust from your investors or shareholders, stakeholders, it is very, very impossible to operate in isolation. So I'll end with that, show less, better data, more stronger community voices. That helps you with credible communication. So thank you very much. And thanks for the opportunity to kind of, take part in this, and looking forward to more of this. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you so much. Gilbert, your closing remarks?
Thanks, Matthews, and big thank you, Venan. I really like your perspectives, and they remind me of the fact that influence is why organizations exist. Organizations, businesses cannot exist without shaping the opinions and decisions of others in their favor. And in order to shape or to elicit a certain favorable decision, whether it's a purchase decision, whether it's a funding decision, whether it's an investment decision, you really have to have credibility. And that credibility is ultimately what will deliver the impact that you need. And credibility, which is more or less a synonym for trust, requires doing the right thing. And we just know that the right thing can be subjective to some extent, but universally every human being will want to live in a good environment because we all want to be safe. We want to live in a good society because we want to have good relationships. We want to have good schools. We want to have good hospitals. We want our neighbors also to enjoy these positive attributes of life. And thirdly, we want to be well governed. We want our common affairs to be managed responsibly by the people we entrust with that kind of responsibility, be it at government level, be it at community level, be it within families, etc. And because that is so critical for credibility, it just makes sense for organizations to invest in this capability. And we know that one can't be good at everything. There are experts in the area of ESG and sustainability. They are experts in the area of communication and influence building. And I would encourage organizations, big or small, to continue investing in building relationships with those experts. Finan is one of them. At Newmark, we have some great colleagues who can advise on the communication side, while colleagues like Finan and the others at your organization would bring in that technical capability. And this is not just a pitch, because sometimes it feels like someone is pitching, but I truly believe that for Africa to leapfrog and become the region that inspires the rest of the world, we actually have to work together. We have to leverage on each other's strengths in our respective areas of authority and expertise. So it's really a call to action to everyone to invest in this, even if not necessarily by recruiting the services of external players, but also just doing it yourself. Like you said, Renan, there is ChatGPT, there is Google. People now have tons of sources of information that they can use to just start. And I commit myself to doing the same thing, although luckily at Newmark, we have embarked on doing some of the things that we believe are going to contribute to the ESG landscape of our continent and the world. Thank you. Back to you, Matthews.
Thank you so much, Gilbert. Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. We've come to the end of our conversation today under the Newmark Group Influence 21 webinar series, where we're talking all things credibility and impact in climate communication. Be sure to catch us again next month with another topic for an exciting conversation. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to catch this on our Newmark Group YouTube channel, the Newmark Group Influence series, where this video will be available. Thanks, Gilbert, and thanks, Lenin, and it's bye from me now.